Hi everyone, hope everyone is well. Today I am reviewing Eylau 1807 Battles of Napoleon from the new publisher Sound of Drums. This is volume 1. I have done an extensive unboxing of this game where I went through all the different components. I'm not going to go through and do exactly the same thing today. Instead, what I'm going to do is we'll have a look at the rulebook, we'll have a look at the scenarios. I've got the game laid out. I've just literally finished playing the full game and I've just set it up quite quickly again. So we'll talk about the mechanics and some of the gameplay and mechanics that make this game quite unique, quite different than anything else certainly I've played before. So with no further ado, we'll have a look at the rulebook first. The rulebook itself is about 32 pages long. It's full colour. I think the 32 pages, having been through the rulebook multiple times, both reading it before I played and using it as a reference during play, don't let the 32 page be a guide of how the level of complexity of the game. One of the reasons I think it is 32 pages is it's very spacious in its layout and presentation. In terms of the quality of the rules, I will be honest, I had no problems understanding any of the rules whatsoever. They all made a lot of sense. There's a few rules that, as I alluded to at the beginning, that are sort of help define this game, I would say. And for those, I read them a few times and got them out on the board and went through them. And I'll talk more about those specifics when we come to them. You can see a full description of the counters, a sequence of play. The sequence of play is one of the things that's interesting, because it's not a chit pull game, but it has a similar sort of mechanic where you're pulling wooden cubes from a bag to determine whose turn it is to activate. And it's that with the command structure, the command phase, sorry, I should say, is a really interesting component of this game. Weather, very straightforward, obviously because of the historical nature of the game. You can imagine there are snowstorms and snow. I have used the historical weather. That's the way I played it. I like my games to be as historically authentic as possible, so I use that. But as you can see, yeah, very neatly laid out. No problem with the language at all. One of the things they do a really good job on is breaking out large chunks of text into more digestible components, which helps both in the reading and the reference for while you're playing. The game has a really interesting system for handling orders. So each, we'll call them division, you will give an order to, and the game explains all the different orders that you can use. They have a direct impact on gameplay, which is, we'll talk more about when we have a look at the game laid out on the board. Your particular army has a fatigue system. And if your army gets over fatigued or hits a certain limit, that's it, game over. Initiative is very straightforward. The activation we'll talk more about, but you can see in the layout, it's very neatly done. The full colour is certainly a very good treatment of a rule book. The other thing I like is there are examples or notes specific to the mechanics to help your understanding. One of the rules that's important, this is not exclusive to this game by a long shot. The facing and the hex is critical. So you are facing the hexes in a specific manner with both your front and the components, either front and rear, or if they're in a different formation, I'll call it. One of the things that's unique, one of the things that's interesting about Napoleonics is with infantry, for example, with foot, either being in column or in line or in square, and on the counters you can present the infantry either in column or in line formation, and there's gameplay differences between the two, which is I really enjoy being an enthusiast of this historic period, and fits the scale of the game really nicely, and it's a really simple mechanic. So for example, one of the drawbacks about being in line, although the foot would present themselves with a good opportunity to fire, because whilst in line there's more muskets being able to fire, It also means that they are susceptible to flank attacks, which is historically very authentic, whilst when in column, and sometimes columns actually, some of the resources I've read, columns can almost be squares, but different to the square formation when being charged by a horse, for example. But in column, you present less muskets to be able to fire, but there are advantages, certainly when it comes to movement, for example. And the game represents all those. Stacking, this is not a game with huge stacks. 2, 3 counters, maybe 4. I'm thinking about some of the sort of the strength losses, step losses counters, example, but not huge stacks for the most part. And you'll see this when we have a look at the board. Movement, very straightforward. And the game does a great job of explaining how these all work. The same with fire combat. Fire combat is quite quick playing, I would describe. There's not a huge amount of rules specifically to presenting the musketry in the game. The same with artillery, very straightforward. And I think, again, just you can see here, it's just one of the great examples where the actual rules are just a couple of really short paragraphs. But what the rulebook does, it takes its time and explains to you with examples and with notes of how those mechanics work. And that's why the rulebook is of the size that it is, rather than an indication of the level of complexity. So line of sight works very straightforward, as does assaulting. We've got some specific chrome to the Cossacks, and that's one of the unusual examples where there are specific rules to specific formations. The same would be true of the Guard, the French Guard, of course, but not too many of those, so it's very digestible. Losses, retreats, again, if you're familiar with playing hex and counter war games, regardless whether you're familiar with the Napoleonics or not, the rules are very streamlined, very straightforward. And then we're into our recovery phase, and then a glossary at the end and credits. So a very digestible rulebook, very well written. My understanding is it originally wasn't written in English, and this is a translation. However, the translation is excellent, and there weren't many. I couldn't think of any instances, to be honest, when I was reading through the rulebook and went, "Oh, that's a kind of slightly strange use of the English language." Yeah, so overall, an excellent rulebook. Now, I do believe from the publisher there is also a living rulebook as well with some further clarity. Personally, I had no problem with the rulebook whatsoever. So I thought this was an excellent piece of work, and I enjoyed reading it, and I enjoyed using it as a reference through the gameplay, partly because of the glossary, but also because we've got the all-important table of contents at the beginning, which is quite extensive. So every now and then I would just question to myself, well, exactly how does that rule work? And no problems finding it very quickly at all. The one thing I probably would point out, which is quite interesting, is there are some alternative leader counters. I like the leader counters with the artwork of the leader. That's how I chose to play. But the rules make a point that not everyone does, and there are alternative leader counters. So I think, again, it's an example where the publisher and the designer and the team behind this project have thought very extensively about how someone new comes to the game, what their personal preferences will be, and how they will digest the rules. So yeah, overall, brilliant job on this. Next, we're going to have a look at the scenarios, notes, and history. So with this game, you get 2 books, one for the rules and one for anything to do pertaining to the scenarios, and an extensive notes and history section, which I really enjoyed. Now, as well as the main game, and the main game is a 2-map game, there are a variety of scenarios that are shorter, smaller, so you're not using 2 maps for them all, which gives, as a player, more, certainly it's a good way to learn the game. And I literally played through each scenario in turn. A couple of them I did play multiple times. So for example here, this scenario here, we're only going to use, you'd only be using one of the maps. It's a smaller or less number of turns. There are less units, we'll call them, on the board, or less divisions on the board, and less reinforcements. because of less turns, etc., etc. And these are a great way to learn the game, and there are several of those. Each scenario follows the same format. It explains the setup, and we'll have a look at the board, how to set the counters up on the board when we look at the board, but also goes through the detail of the reinforcements. There are only a very small number of special rules per scenario, and what I found was going through these scenarios in turn was that a lot of the special rules are actually taking rules away from the main game, but in a way that made sense, especially for a shorter scenario, a smaller playing scenario. Most, if not, I can't think of a scenario that I played that I did not finish in an evening with the smaller scenarios. So there, if you've got an evening and you want to play the game, I would suggest going through that. And I would also suggest playing the scenarios in turn to help your understanding of the game and help your understanding of the level of tactical options you have playing through either both sides or whatever side you're playing. Again, very nice spec. I mean, this is the main battle itself. As you can see, it's just 1.5 pages really. Not a huge number of special rules specifically to it. I had no problems setting up all the units on the board. No problems understanding the reinforcements. It's very clear. It's very spacious. I find this really helps, especially when you're setting up a 2-map game. And actually, setting the game up doesn't take too long either. So, yeah, good variety. Then we're into all the notes. And I talked more about this on my unboxing. These are excellent. I really enjoy reading through the notes and the history. I also really enjoyed the thoughts from the designer about the approach to this game, and it's a good read. And as I'm sure a lot of you know, I do like reading. When I'm not playing war games, I'm generally reading about the history behind it. So I really enjoyed this, and it's a welcome addition to the game. So again, a very fine production. Everything is beautifully laid out. It has a very sort of high level of quality. Both the materials, the printing materials for both the rule book and this book as well are absolutely excellent. So a very fine set of books that you get in the game, I would describe. What I would say, just a final note on the scenarios, and it's just my opinion. You are buying this game, in my opinion, for the main game, the main 2-map game that I'll show in a minute. Some war games where you get 2, 3, 4 maps, I think you could argue some of them have a number of scenarios that are just 1 map, and they're just as much fun or as engaging as the large games. And I'm not saying that this is not that. What I am saying is that all the scenarios that were 1 map scenarios were just really leading up to wanting to play the 2-map game. So that is a consideration. If you have the room for a 2-map game, then I think that's important to note. If you don't, I'd also think very seriously about that. But we'll have a look at the map now with some counters laid out. So I've got the game set up. I've just finished playing through the game for the second time, and I set it all back up. This is not the optimum setup by any stretch of the imagination, both for the French or for the Russians. I've set it up quite cheerfully, somewhat deliberately, to showcase some of the components of the game and some of the mechanics. So please do not think this is how you should set up either side, because it's not. But there is a lot of flexibility in the setup for the player. So I've set it up within the rules, but just maybe not the optimum. You can already see it's a 2-map game, so the map divide is here right in the center. I've got the mounted maps. I like them because when I'm making YouTube videos like this one, paper and plexi can often flare from both the sunlight and from the studio lights that I use. It's a very nice mounted map. The paper map is very nice too. They're both exactly the same. It's just the materials. You can see the tonal range, the color range of the map. They've gone for, obviously because of the actual battle itself, they've gone for a snowy, icy sort of feel, which is thematically in keeping. The counters really nicely pop from the artwork on the map. The map artwork itself is very, very, very readable. It's very clear, the components, the contents of the hex, and had no problems whatsoever understanding the terrain and the gameplay implications of that terrain. You can also see here on the French, we've got a number of divisions, a number of units here, and the Russians along here. The French, however, do have some significant reinforcements through the course of the battle. They will come on from that side of the board. The Russians have Prussians, reinforcements, not anywhere near to the number that the French have, but they start with them much more. The Prussians come on from this side of the board. I've set it up here as if I was playing 2-player. If you were playing solo, like I have been doing, you'd still want to keep the orientation of the hex, but it looks very pleasing to the eye, regardless of which way you're playing it. As you can also see, now there's quite a bit of the board that's just off camera. So there's a bit more this way and a little bit that way, and only a little bit this and a little bit this way. So I've not been able to get the whole thing in one shot. If I stood on a chair, I suppose I could have done that. But it gives you some sense of the scale of the actual game itself. So it looks great. It's very playable from the get-go. It doesn't take too long to set up. Now, what I'll also say on the setup itself, you won't be able to see at this distance, and I'll just use my glasses to point them out. When you're setting up the individual divisions, and that's, for example, is a division here or a unit, another one here, so forth. There, the guards. I put Napoleon with the guards. There he is, etc., etc. There are markings on the map that help you where to set up those specific units, and they're very nicely done because they're very faint but very readable, so they don't interfere. I would actually go out on a limb and say this is one of the most, I really enjoyed setting the game up. It's very clear where to set up the units. Under the rules, you can set up within 3 hexes, so you've got a lot of certain amount of tactical flexibility. And especially on the smaller scenarios, I play them maybe just the first turn a couple of times to try and work out some better, from both sides, some better setup options. And that's an engaging part of the game for me, and wargaming in general, of course. Yeah, I think overall it looks great. There's definitely, as I said in the unboxing, the component quality of both the counters and the map are excellent. Absolutely excellent. The counters themselves, and we'll zoom the camera in a little bit when we talk about some mechanics, are very, very pleasant, very high quality, very easy to read. As you can see, I wear glasses when I'm playing games, and I had no problem at all with any of the readability, both of the map and the counters. So I'm going to talk about the mechanics, and some of the mechanics that I really admire in this game, that I've really enjoyed using whilst playing. And this board here, is you're going to use this extensively during the game. And I'm going to use this unit here as an example. So for every unit in the game scenario you're playing, you'll be given that unit an order, and you have these counters here that have the order names on them. And the rulebook explains to you what you can do and what impact all the different orders have in the game. Let's suppose that I'm going to give that unit there, which is this unit here, the move order. And if I was playing through the 2-map game, I'd have a whole series of orders on here for all the different units that I'm playing with. And it's a really simple way of recording what order you are giving all your different units. The second thing you do, which I really enjoyed, and I enjoyed that system a lot, just going through and picking the orders, thinking about what I'd want those units to be doing in that particular turn. The second thing that you do is that, depending on the scenario, you put a bunch of blue cubes for the French and a bunch of green cubes for the Russians into a bag, and you'll put a couple of these red ones in as well. We'll talk more about them in a second. But you bunch of them in the bag, depending again on the scenario you're playing. We blindly take them out, and let's suppose we get a blue one, a French. And let's just suppose I've got a whole bunch of units, but I really want to do something with these. Then I'll activate that unit. I put the cube there in the first activation section here, and I can activate that unit, and I can move them, etc. Whatever it is that I've given the order to. The order itself has a couple of implications that are really important. Number one, there are restrictions on certain orders, as you'd expect. So, for example, as this is a horse unit here, cavalry, I wouldn't be able to charge with them with a move. I would need to have given them an attack order. Neither can I move them into a hex adjacent to the enemy. There are no zones of control, zones of influence in this game. So with the move order, I can move them, but I cannot charge with them, cannot move them adjacent to the enemy. The other important thing, so that's the first activation. Now if I was to take a second cube out the bag, and let's just suppose it's another blue one, and let's suppose that I want to do something with them again, I can place a second activate, I can activate them for the second time. But on the second activation, there are further detriments to that particular activation. So for example, with this unit being horse, being cavalry, it's a -2 movement points. So the movement point, the movement capability of this unit on the second activation is less. And if I had a third, I'll take one out of the bag. For example, here we go. If I had a third, that would be even more detrimental. Often during the game, you will be activating units multiple times. So you have this sort of this sense that as you're activating the units, certainly on the movement, they are becoming less and less effective. They're tiring, if that's the right word. That's quite interesting from a tactical point of view. It's a really interesting mechanic. It makes you think. Often in chit pull games, if a unit has have numerous chits being pulled, normally it's as capable the second time as it is the first. That's not the case in this game, and I really enjoyed that mechanic. The second interesting component to this is the fatigue system. So again, depending on the scenario, you get a number of fatigue cubes that you put here in this fatigue section. These are worth, I think, 10 points and 1 point. And you start off with a certain number. And if you, these are removed by giving certain orders. So for example, the move order costs me a fatigue point. I lose that. Basically, my army is becoming more fatigued. In particular, the attack order down here costs 2 points, so 2 greys or whatever. But I can charge with that. And the cubes can go in. So if I take certain objectives and if I lose units, etc. So the number of fatigue cubes reduces from my experience during the game. But by taking key objectives, can be balanced. So I really enjoy these 3 quite simple mechanics. Both the order system, by giving orders and having counters per order, so I don't have to record anything. And predicting what I think will happen in that turn. The activation system, which I think is very elegant and very simple. And the fatigue system as well. I do also like, there's also an initiative area of the game, of the orders, and that contributes to who goes first in the first bit of the turn. But I really enjoy those mechanics. If I was to pick one thing about the mechanics of this game, it's this right here that I really enjoyed. It also lends itself incredibly well to playing the game solo. I'm not talking about playing against a bot. You're playing both sides, because this effectively, in my mind, is very similar to a chit pull system, but it's got a little bit more depth to it. Because it makes you think a bit more about where my formation is, what I want them to do, knowing that when I activate them again, etc., etc. So I really enjoyed that. Now, on the smaller scenarios, because even with playing one map, this is a nice, lovely mounted player aid for this. I would say you can actually place these next to the units themselves and along with the order, but I prefer to have them off board, declutter the board. I do like games where the board is mostly the units, but yeah, I thought this was a really nice mechanic. I really enjoyed it. It streamlines many things. It does mean that, especially with the 2-map game, as you can see, if you're using all these units here, which we've seen on the board, for example, especially for the beginning for the Russian player, you're going to be activating them multiple times. There's a lot of activations in a turn. So therefore, playing the full game, the 2-map game, a reasonable time investment is required. So I'm also going to talk about how combat works in the game. And it is a very streamlined, very straightforward system. So let's suppose I'm using these 2 counters here just to demonstrate the point. I mean, they'll be on the map and all that sort of stuff. And let's suppose I've got this Russian unit here on the map giving musketry fire to this French unit here. Remember those red cubes I talked about? Well, when we pull one of those from the bag, and depending on the scenario you play, will determine how many of those you put in the bag, but normally I think you only have a maximum of 2. We can give musketry to each other, and it's an alternating musketry system, firing system. So I pick the unit, give fire, opponent does the same thing, back and forth we go. We've got our strength points, firing strength points column. We roll the dice, and it gives us a number, and that's how many step losses we apply. However, there are modifiers, as you'd expect. So we've got strength point modifiers. So being in line formation, which is the best formation to be in for infantry, giving fire on the enemy. And this counter, is in line formation. On the flip side, it's in column formation. So column formation is ×1, so strength points are 4. However, line formation, a maximum of 4 strength points can give ×2. So this would give 8 strength points. So I'm using this column here. Then we've got dice roll modifiers for the fire combat, depending on the weather. And for example, if the target is infantry in column, much more susceptible to musketry fire, so L+2, for example. And let's just suppose I inflict 1 damage on this French counter here. As we could see, there's no step losses. That's column, that's line. But instead we use these counters here to record the current strength point of the unit. So with 1 damage, we use that 10 orientated towards the top, that's how I use it, and put underneath like so. If you prefer, the game just come with these counters. That's its current strength points. Put that underneath and so forth. It's a really straightforward system. It flows really well. Combat is not overly complex. There aren't too many steps. It's not buckets of dice either. It just flows really well. And to be fair, once you've been through a couple of times, you've used a couple of terrain types. For example, most of the fire combat is no effect. It's only really the woods and the sort of village stroke cemetery area. It's very streamlined and works really nicely, which is good because as you could see on the map before, there are a lot of counters on the board. Yeah, I just really enjoyed it. I really like using these counters to record the strength points. As you can see, some units can soak up quite a lot, and you can get strength points, lost strength points back as well, depending on the orders that you give. So it's a mechanic that I think works really nicely. If we flip this over to the other side, excuse me while I do that, we can see here our assault and charge table. Again, as streamlined. Defensive fire first. We work out the odds ratio between the 2 units. So let's say the French are assaulting this poor Russian unit here. And let's just say imagine it's from the flank. So if on the hexes, we've got our odds dice roll modifier, We've got our defending unit modifiers, the assault charging unit modifiers. We roll 2d6, and if the result is equal or less than 8, the assaulted charge unit loses 1 step and retreats its 4 movement potential. Very streamlined, and it works incredibly well with the sheer amount of counters that you have on the board. So some overall concluding thoughts. Things I liked about this game. The production is incredible. It is an absolutely stunning physical war game. All the components are beautifully laid out. The graphic design is incredible. The component quality is absolutely first class. Certainly easily in the sort of the best category of war game production I've ever seen in my collection. Both the counters, the map, the rulebook, player aids, the sheer variety of aids for you as a player that you can choose between. Like I said, those strength point losses, alternative counters for the leaders. I like the leader artwork myself. Incredible, absolutely incredible production. It's really exciting to see a brand new publisher come into our hobby with such a high quality product straight out of the gates. And I, for one, am very excited to look forward to more games in this series from this publisher. I love the cube activation. It works really well. I'm a big fan of chip pull games, as I'm sure you're all aware. I like this system as well. It's really interesting the impact the second and third activation have on the particular units themselves. I like the fatigue system. I like the choices it makes the player make. And there's quite often playing the game, I had quite difficult choices to make. I also love, and I think this is important for me, this is a through and through hex and counter war game. And I love that. The retreating system, the firing system, the assault, the artillery, the cavalry and the charging, the restrictions of the order system. It feels familiar, I would say, but also with some nuances and some slight differences compared to a lot of other Napoleonic hex and counter games that I play. And I really enjoyed both that familiarity, but also the things that this game was adding to my gameplay sessions. And I really, really enjoyed that. I love the scale. It is a 2-map game. You will need to have room for 2 maps. As I said earlier, the only caution I would give is if you've only got room for 1 map, and by all means, if you just love the idea of it, just playing on some of the scenarios on 1 map, then absolutely go for it. But for me, as a player, a Napoleonic wargame enthusiast, the game is the 2-map game. I enjoyed the single map scenarios, but I loved the big 2-map scenario. And that's probably indicative of the type of Napoleonic gaming experience that I love the most. It does take a long time to play. It does not take long to set up. I have set this up. I play in smaller bursts really, so I'll play an hour here, an hour there over the course of a week or whatever. I would say with dedication, you could set this up and play the large game comfortably in a day, but I think you definitely need a day to do so. And it is a demanding game of both players. There are lots of decisions to make, not always easy decisions. Definitely there's a lot of depth to the strategy, and strategy with a lowercase s, for both players. Choices to make, different things to try. I enjoyed some of the scenarios, some of the smaller scenarios. I would enjoy doing it with the larger scenario as well, trying out some different techniques, playing solo. I enjoyed it playing it solo very much. It solos incredibly well. As I said, with the proviso, you're not playing against the game, you're playing both sides. And I love the spectacle of a large 2-map or 3 or 4 map game, of course. Large formations, lots of counters on the board, lots of scope for moving, lots of scope for narrative happening through the battle. I would say, having played it a couple of times, I don't think the game particularly favours one side or the other. They've both got their own challenges. From a word to the wise, the Russians have got to keep an eye on that south side of the board. Very easy for the French because that's where the French are going to bring their reinforcements in. However, the Russians themselves, I always felt, had more control over the north side of the board. And it creates quite an interesting maelstrom of combat. Overall, if you're in the market for an incredibly produced Napoleonic war game, you have space for 2 maps, you have the inclination to play a longer form game. I mean, it's not a full monster by any stretch of the imagination, but I'll call it a longer form game. The level of complexity, I feel, is medium, but maybe a little bit on the lower side of medium. There are other Napoleonic, games, hex and counter games that I would put this under in terms of its complexity, and that's mostly because once you get once you get your head around the order system, the cubes, the combat system, retreating, charging, forming into squares, the difference between column and line, they're all very straightforward and very streamlined. So I think it's on the lower end of the medium complexity for me as a wargame enthusiast. But so if you're in the market for something like that, then you should absolutely look at this game. It is an incredible production from what is going to be, I think, a very exciting publisher for both our wargaming hobby and Napoleonic hex encounter, which is probably one of my favourite parts of our hobby. So yeah, big thumbs up from me, as you can probably tell. I'm really looking forward to seeing what they do next in the series. This is volume 1. There are many other parts of Napoleonic history, maybe some that are less discovered. I'd love to see them tackle some of those. So really excited by the game. I would and always a testament for me, I think, is having been through and done this video review today, I kind of want to leave it on the table and play through it again. That sort of tells me a lot about how I feel about the game. Thoroughly enjoyed it. I love the narrative, I love the mechanics, I love the production. So yeah, big recommendation. If you've played it or you're thinking about getting it on the table, please leave a comment in the comment section. Love to hear what the community think about this game. If you have any questions, pop them in the comment section. I'll do my best to answer. But of course, anyone else jump in and answer for me, absolutely. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching as always, and take care. Thank you.